What is a Docker image? What is a Docker container? And how do they actually work together? We already know Docker is a tool that lets you package your application with all its dependencies so you can run it anywhere. So where do images and containers come into this? A really good analogy for this is baking a cake. So you have the recipe, which has all your instructions and steps and ingredients. And when you follow that recipe and bake the cake, you can have a nice cake and eat it. Now you can imagine that the Docker image is like the recipe. It's a packaged set of instructions for your application. It includes everything your app needs to run, which means it includes your code, your dependencies, and your environment setup. And you might be thinking, well, where does this recipe come from? And that is where your Dockerfile comes in. A Dockerfile is just where you write the instructions for how your application is built. For example, in this Dockerfile, you might say install node, copy your app code, and install dependencies. So instead of manually having to do it, you're just describing the steps for Docker to use. And Docker takes that file and packages it up into an image. And then when you run that image, you get a container. A container is the running instance of the image. So if the image is the recipe, then the container is the cake. And just like a recipe, using the same image, you can create multiple containers. So every time you run this image, Docker spins up another container. And there's actually something important to note here. You don't always have to write your own Docker file. There's such thing as pre-built images. For example, databases like Redis or Postgres have pre-built images that you can use. So you can just pull them in, run them as containers, without any setup. Let's take this one step further. So far, we've just been talking about one container, one recipe or image. But in reality, an application has multiple parts. It could have a front end, a back end, a database. And each of these run in their own container. So remembering what we just did, we could have our own Docker files for each of these and run them individually. But that means that you have to run multiple commands and make sure they work together, and it can get a little bit messy. And this is where Docker Compose comes in. Docker Compose lets you define multiple containers and run them all together. And inside your Docker Compose file, you would define the containers that your application needs. For example, a front-end container, a back-end container, and a database container. So instead of starting each container by itself, you can just run a command Docker Compose up, and it will create all those containers for you all together. So it's like a more singular setup. This is great because it makes your setup really easy. You only have to run one command to spin all those containers up. So putting all of that together, our Docker file is where we write instructions of how our app needs to be built. An image is the packaged Docker file, and a container is a running instance of that image. And Docker Compose allows you to run multiple containers together. It's really easy if you just remember the image as a recipe and the container as a cake, and it will stick in your mind. I hope this video cleared things up for you, and if you enjoyed it, check out the rest of my software concepts playlist. But other than that, I'll see you next time.